At their best, historical dramas immerse audiences in transportive cinematic spectacles that give modern viewers a real sense for what it would have been like to live in far-off, distant times and places, or to witness major events firsthand. Then, there's Michael Bay's Pearl Harbor, which attempts to turn one of the most devastating real-world attacks in U.S. history into both a rousing action-adventure and a swooning romance, with decidedly mixed results. Today, let's unpack everything Pearl Harbor the movie got wrong. But before we kick off the mayhem, make sure you've subscribed to the Weird History channel. After that, drop down into the comments and let us know what other Hollywood history you want debunked. All right, let's break some heartnets. Even before World War II, there were long-standing diplomatic tensions between the United States and Japan. The Japanese were wary about American territorial expansion into the Pacific, including the annexation of the Hawaiian Islands. Americans were well aware of Japan's own desire to expand its territory and access valuable natural resources. Their relationship soured further by Japan's invasion of Manchuria in 1931, and eventually China in the late 1930s. By 1938, President Franklin D. Roosevelt asked U.S. companies to cease providing Japan with weapons or other wartime provisions. In 1940, following the Japanese invasion of French Indochina, the U.S. halted the flow of even more goods and shipments to the Japanese, and President Roosevelt started moving the Pacific Fleet from its base in San Diego to Hawaii. What followed was a delicate diplomatic dance, with both countries publicly preparing for a military conflict, but stopping short of provoking an all-out war. A decisive moment came in July of 1941, when the U.S. formally ceased all oil exports to Japan, partially as ongoing sanctions, partially to conserve its oil supply for potential crises. Regardless of the motivation, the decision forced the Japanese into a difficult choice: either mend the relationship with the U.S. or invade oil-rich territories, such as the Dutch East Indies, to make up the difference, or surprise attack the U.S. Navy. The belief among Japanese leadership was that a surprise attack on the U.S. Navy would prevent Americans from entering a war to prevent further Japanese incursions into Southeast Asia. By destroying crucial ships and equipment and undermining American morale, Japan hoped to prevent U.S. military action altogether, or at least buy some time to improve their own fleet before any American military response. The Japanese had intended to officially declare war on the U.S. a half hour before the Pearl Harbor attack started. In practice, it took too long to transmit the 5,000-word message to the Japanese embassy in Washington, so it didn't arrive until an hour after the attack had begun. Regardless, the U.S. did get a bit of a heads up, thanks to codebreakers who had already started working on deciphering the message before it was delivered. Just before 8 a.m. local time on Sunday, December 7, 1941, the Imperial Japanese Navy Air Service started its attack on the Pearl Harbor base. The full assault included 353 Japanese aircraft, which launched in 2 waves from 6 different aircraft carriers. A total of 2,304 Americans were killed in the attack, and 1,178 more were wounded, making this the deadliest day in all of recorded Hawaiian history. Due to the surprise nature of the attack, Japanese losses were comparably light, with just 64 total casualties. Of the 8 U.S. Navy battleships that were stationed at Pearl Harbor, all received some damage, while 4 were sunk. However, because the ships were stationed in shallow water, it was easier to retrieve the wreckage and repair the damage than it would have been had they sank at sea. All the damaged ships, except for the USS Arizona, were eventually raised, while 6 of the 8 went on to participate in the war. In April of 1942, with the Pacific War now well underway, the U.S. responded to Pearl Harbor with an aerial attack on the Japanese mainland, led by Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle, which came to be known as the Doolittle Raid. This was the first U.S. air operation to actually strike Japan itself, and featured 16 bombers launched from a U.S. aircraft carrier, taking out military and industrial targets in Tokyo and other nearby facilities. The raid claimed around 50 lives and injured 400 more. And though it only caused minor damage to Japan's infrastructure, it had a significant psychological impact on both the American and Japanese public. Okay, time for the movie version. Jumping 60 years ahead to 2001, director Michael Bay and producer Jerry Bruckheimer, a team infamously known for high-spectacle blockbusters, released their 183-minute epic Pearl Harbor, recounting the events of that day, plus adding an epilogue about the Doolittle Raid. The film was a significant financial success, pulling in over $450 million worldwide. But while everyone showed up to see the movie, it was not particularly well received. With just a 24% on Rotten Tomatoes, 6 Golden Raspberry nominations, and even a memorable song from Team America World Police, highlighting its various failures, Pearl Harbor has a foul reputation among filmgoers and historians alike. The inaccuracies come fast and early. A flashback shows childhood friends in 1923 playing around a Stearman crop-dusting plane. But this particular plane wasn't available for civilian use for another 2 decades after World War II, which is an embarrassing error to make in a film about military history. Pre-attack, another sequence finds Rafe McCauley and Evelyn Johnson, the film's central lovers, played by Ben Affleck and Kate Beckinsale, checking out the Queen Mary, an iconic British ship originally built back in 1936. But while Pearl Harbor depicts the Queen Mary with its modern-day red, white, and black paint job, in the 1940s it would have been colored entirely gray. During World War II, the Queen Mary was used to transport soldiers, and the gray color scheme helped as camouflage. In fact, Americans famously nicknamed the vessel the Gray Ghost. It had a whole nickname, Michael. Speaking of Evelyn, she's seen serving as a nurse alongside, well, basically all the other women in the film. While it's true there were many female nurses stationed at Pearl Harbor, it's misleading to depict nursing as their only job. 10,000 American women worked as codebreakers during World War II. It's also important to note that unlike the Michael Bay version, the real Pearl Harbor was home to a number of non-white women. Local Hawaiian women actually helped to salvage some of the ships that were sunk during the attack. Evelyn's hospital is among the sites that get blown up real good in the film, even though the real Pearl Harbor attack wasn't centered there. Ammunition was expensive, and the Japanese were laser-focused on high-value targets that might dissuade America's Navy. So they were aiming for battleships, aircraft, and weapon repositories, not injured and sick people. Depicting a bombing of a hospital that wasn't bombed is seriously misleading. And it's not the only major error in Pearl Harbor that tried to misinform an entire American generation. The film also suggests the Doolittle raid was a turning point in the Pacific Campaign, when it was actually not significant beyond a boost in public relations. You might also expect a film so steeped in military history to pay close attention to details about weapons, vehicles, and the rest of the machinery of war, most of which is very well documented and easy to reference. But you would be wrong. On several occasions, 1950s technology pops up in this 1941 set film, including a speedboat and a nuclear-powered submarine. Well, at least they had the decency to leave out James Bond. Beyond these big picture slip-ups, the film gets a bevy of smaller details wrong as well. One sailor is seen with a pack of Marlboro Lights, even though these cigarettes weren't introduced until the 1970s. There's also confusion about various military branches, roles, and occupations. We're told that Ben Affleck's character, Rafe McCauley, is an Army Air Force pilot, yet he's seen receiving a physical at a Navy hospital. It's also unclear how he came to be assigned to the Royal Air Force fighting for Britain years before America's actual entry into the war, nor why he was returned to the U.S. Air Force following a crash landing abroad. Even more confusingly, we're told that McCauley and his childhood friend, Danny Walker, played by Josh Hartnett, are fighter pilots. Yet during the Doolittle raid sequence, they're seen flying bombers, which would have been an entirely different job requiring a new skill set. Jon Voight plays President Roosevelt, and one memorable sequence finds him discussing possible retaliation for the attack with his cabinet. In an effort to make a point about resilience and doing the impossible, Roosevelt emerges from his wheelchair and rises to his feet. Not only is there no evidence this actually happened, it's out of character based on what we know of the man. Historian Nicholas Evans Sarantakis notes that Roosevelt avoided drawing attention to his disability, the result of a childhood polio infection, while historian Bruce Reynolds criticizes the sequence as a caricature of the president, who was not inclined toward dramatic gestures or motivational speeches. In other words, the movie went too far with FDR. The Doolittle raid sequence has inaccuracies too. Though the leather jackets the men wear were inspired by real history, the actual jackets worn on the day contained Chinese characters on the back. After the planes completed their bombing runs over Japan, the pilots were to land in unoccupied China. The messages written on their jackets were designed to help locals identify them as friendlies and escort them safely out of the area. Throughout the raid, we see a nervous Evelyn eavesdropping on the mission through a radio back in Hawaii. But of course, any sneak attack on Japan would have observed radio silence. If Evelyn could pick up the broadcast, so could the Japanese targets Doolittle and his team were hoping to surprise. And even if Doolittle and his men had been in communication during the raid, they would have used short-range units rather than broadcasting their chatter all the way back to Hawaii. Furthermore, sending a radio signal that distance from a plane wasn't even possible in the 1940s. Any long-range communication back to base would have been conducted via Morse code, and it's tough to make Morse code thrilling, although we think Michael Bay could find a way. In all, the film Pearl Harbor cost around $140 million to produce, more money than the U.S. spent recovering from the original attack. A huge budget also prompted a few historians to publicly wonder why the studio couldn't afford to hire a consultant to ensure they got all the details right. Still, historian Harry Gailey is not entirely down on everything in the movie. He singles out the movie's swing-heavy soundtrack, noting that this was, in fact, the most popular American genre at the time, and would have likely been popular among the enlisted men at the base. In fact, the #1 song in America at the time of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor was by big band conductor and trumpet player Glenn Miller, who was prominently featured on the Pearl Harbor soundtrack. Who says Bayhem can't be educational? So what do you think? What's your favorite Michael Bay movie? Let us know in the comments below, and while you're at it, check out some of these other videos from our weird history.